All right. Hello, everyone. My name is DiBella. I am the Cloud Management Solution Engineer for VMware. And essentially, what Cloud Solution Engineer means is it's a fancy way of saying that I am one of the technical experts as it relates to VMware's cloud management software, specifically our monitoring, logging, and automation software. So, what we're going to be doing today is starting to do an overview of the Aria suite of technologies. And we're going to do a deep dive into Aria Operations specifically. Okay. But before I dive deeper into Aria Operations, I think that it is very important to set the stage and really make sure that we understand the context of the data center environment, of your infrastructure environment in which Aria Operations would sit. So, with that, I really like to go over this slide, and I promise you this is only just one slide. I will be diving into the demo shortly. But where this begins is in the center of this page here, where we see virtual machines as well as containers and all of the different applications, the applications that make your business run, that your partners, your customers all depend on. They reside on either virtual machines or containers. And of course, those virtual machines and those containers, they run either at the edge within your own private data center, a hybrid cloud environment, or a public cloud environment. So essentially, there's a lot of different hardware destinations where our data could reside, where our applications could reside. Now, what VMware has sought to do is create a consistent infrastructure in which you can consistently run these virtual machines and these containers on any of these hardware platforms. So it abstracts away the underlying hardware. And the way that we do that is we use our different virtualization software called the VMware Cloud Foundation. Many of you are probably very familiar with how VMware has virtualized compute in the form of vSphere and all the goodness that comes with it. But VMware has since gone on to virtualize storage as well as networking in the form of vSAN and NSX, respectively. And it allows you to do some really interesting things around per VM storage policy application, automatic deployment of your networks and network constructs and security policies. And really, the idea is to create this consistency in your infrastructure. And why is that important? Well, I'm an engineer, and a lot of the people watching these videos are engineers themselves. And they're very familiar with the idea that if you want to make something stable, right, the easiest way to do so is to have simple, repeatable building blocks. And as a result, it makes troubleshooting, it makes deploying, it makes scaling, it makes automating, it makes all of these things a lot easier to do. Now, what we have done is, of course, provided this consistent infrastructure. But we aren't only providing consistent infrastructure, we also want to provide a consistent operating model. And this idea of consistency extends to the way in which we manage our environment, the way we automate our environment. All right. And this is really where I focus, and this is where we will be focusing in the next couple videos. But what I've done as it relates to our technologies, decompose the two components of consistent operations into two buckets, right? And I view these as somewhat sequential buckets in the sense that you're going to want to deal with the first one first and the second one second. Now, the first one pertains to stability, uptime, and performance. How can we make sure that our environment is as stable, it has sufficient uptime, and is performing as effectively as possible? Once we've done that, once we've ensured that stability, then we can move on to automation. And now what we focus on in automation primarily is automatic provisioning as well as automatic remediation. But before we get there, again, we want to focus on this first bucket. Now, Where I usually like to start is Aria Operations, formerly known as vRealize Operations. Now, there's a couple different things that Aria Operations does, and I really want to give you a sense of what those are before we even jump into the demo. Now, first things first, is performance optimization. Now, this is the first of many whys as to why do people use this tool? Why do people invest in this tool? Why is it considered the industry standard for hypervisor management? Okay, now the first is performance and optimization. Really, one of the key goals with this tool is to ensure that all of our different workloads are performing as effectively as possible. So that means we're right-sizing our workloads. There's no contention with our workloads. We're dynamically moving things around so that there isn't contention. Additionally, cost and capacity management is the second pillar as to the why behind the tool. Now, it's very important for us to understand the capacity of our environment, right? We don't ever want to be in a situation where we're caught without available resources when we're trying to deploy a business critical application, all right? Or we need to throw more resources at a particular application to help it scale. So one of the things that this tool can do is it will allow us to look at the overall capacity of our environment, understand when we're going to run out of capacity. So that way you and many others are able to predict when you might need to procure more resources. But of course, it's not just enough to know about the available capacity. We also want to be able to have a sense of what the cost of our environment is and understand where can we reduce the cost of our environment? Where can we reuse, or I should say reclaim, unused resources? Another really big part of the tool is monitoring and troubleshooting. Now, this tool, in many ways, is like 1984's Big Brother, where it's constantly on, constantly watching, constantly monitoring your environment. And if something goes wrong, it's going to tell you. It's going to tell you that, hey, CPUs are running hot, something was disconnected, right? There's an issue with your storage. There's an issue with your OS. Now, it's not just enough to know that there's something wrong. We also want to have an ability to troubleshoot against those problems. So Aria Operations also comes with different troubleshooting capabilities, which we'll dive into in just a moment. Now, last but not least is compliance. Now, compliance comes in kind of two flavors, right? There's two different perspectives for compliance. There's an internal as well as external compliance. Internal compliance, you have your different security teams. They say, hey, look, you have to abide by these configurations for your hypervisor, for your virtual machines, for your different hosts. And what we can do is apply those configuration demands from our security team or from whatever team to our environment. And what Aria Operations will do is it'll check against your environment to ensure that you're meeting those different configuration standards. So that's the internal perspective. The external perspective is from a state, local, federal entity perspective, where they have different regulatory requirements that you need to abide by. For example, CIS or PCI, or really straightforward one is hospitals have to abide by HIPAA. So there's different compliance standards that you need to abide by. And again, what you can do is you can activate these different regulatory benchmarks. And what Aria Operations will do is it will inform you if something is deviating from one of those regulatory benchmarks, right? So I will talk a little bit more in detail about some of these subsequent technologies, such as Log Insight, Aria Automation, Salt Stack, but we're not going to demo those just yet. I do think it is worth potentially calling out at this point that a lot of these different technologies have very clean integrations with each other. And what that essentially means is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Because, for example, let's say I'm doing some troubleshooting with an Aria Operations, and I want to look at the appropriate related contextual logs. I can automatically pull up those relevant logs from Log Insight. The two are integrated so the logs can feed into Aria Operations and you can see them from that single user interface, and it just makes it that much easier. So there's a lot of integrations like that. But just for the interest of time, we won't be talking too much about Log Insight today, Cloud Health, Aria Automation, or SaltStack. Those will come at a later date in this series. But for now, let's be done with the slideware and let's just get right into the demo. All right, so here I am within my demo environment. Now you can see just from the Launchpad itself, the home page, some of these pillars are very similar to what we were discussing before, right? The observability for monitoring and troubleshooting, capacity to understand what our available resources are and cost to assign a dollar value to those different capacity objects within our environment. Now, before I jump too deep into clicking around the actual interface, there's a couple things that I want to talk about. We talked a little bit about the why of this tool. I now want to talk about the how of this tool. So how does this tool work? All right. And the way that this tool works is it collects data off of your vCenter. And it translates all of that data into a series of tables, graphs, metrics, dashboards, essentially easily visualizable and consumable information that you can then make informed decisions off of. Now, in order to do that, we have to deploy an OVA within our vCenter environment. And that OVA will function either as Aria Operations itself, or if we're in the cloud-hosted version of Aria Operations, it will function as the cloud proxy, or essentially the data pump, as I like to refer to it. It moves the data from your on-prem environment into your cloud environment, okay? And we are able to see those different integrations here, right? So we can see that this has been deployed in vCenter. But it is also important to note that this environment, that Aria Operations, isn't limited to just looking at your vCenter environment. You are also able to look at a lot of other third-party objects. So those third-party objects can be things like your NetApp storage arrays, your Cisco switches, your Dell servers, your SQL databases, your IaaS servers, right? We're able to pull in metrics via a series of adapters, which we call management packs, into your Aria Operations environment, right? So it is not limited to just your vCenter environment, and it's not limited to just your private data center environment. If we want to pull in data from AWS, Azure, GCP, we are able to pull in data, pull in metrics from all of the major hyperscalers. Okay, so it's important to understand a little bit about the how. Now, once we understand the how, then we can start to dive deeper into the different functional components of this. And one of the places that I really like to start is under capacity. And the reason I like to start under capacity is because they have this right sizing portion of the tool. And I really like starting with right sizing for a couple of different reasons. One, I see a lot of people using and taking advantage and getting a lot of value out of this portion of the tool. Secondly, I like jumping in here because it's probably one of the most straightforward, easy to understand portions of this tool, and it will help us just get our brain juices flowing. So once I click on right size, I'm presented with all of these different data centers that I might have. connected to my Aria Operations environment. And I'm going to click on one of the data centers. Let's click on STJ. And when I click on that data center, it's going to show us the total number of oversized virtual machines as well as undersized virtual machines. And it will give us a sense of what the potential reduction or savings in terms of CPU and memory are, as well as give us a sense of, okay, what additional CPU, what additional memory might we need to provide to these different virtual machines. Now, if I look further below, I'll see broken apart by cluster all of the different virtual machines that are both oversized as well as undersized. And here we'll see what their allocated CPU and memory is, as well as what their allocated, we'll see what their allocated CPU is, the recommended reduction, allocated memory, and recommended memory reduction. We'll see all the individual virtual machines themselves. And now, of course, before you go and right size all these different workloads, what you're going to want to do is have a conversation with your different developers, have a conversation with your different application owners, because as many of you probably know, they're not too happy when you go and just resize all of their workloads. And a lot of times, you'll have a lot of developers and application owners will go up to you and say, hey, look, I need more resources. I don't want you to take anything away. My application is running slow because it doesn't have enough vCPU. It doesn't have enough memory. And this data is very, very useful when it comes to having those informed decisions. So what you're able to do is export all this information into a CSV. And then you can share that information. You can arm yourself with that information to go have these intelligent conversations with different application owners and different developers, right? Now, after you've done that, they'll probably say to you, hey, look, for reasons good, bad, or ugly, these 3 virtual machines, we want to exclude them from this list, all right? And if you want to exclude them from this list of virtual machines that need to be resized, you can, and you'll stop getting alerts on them. Now, once you have excluded the ones that you don't want to resize, what you can do is you can resize them right from here. All right. It'll provide you an overview of what the resizing is going to do. We, of course, have to acknowledge that these workloads are going to be interrupted because there's no such thing as hot takeaway. This tool does support hot add, but there's no such thing as hot takeaway at this point. So since there is no such thing as hot takeaway, a lot of our developers, a lot of our application owners, they might say to us, hey, look, I'm convinced, I agree with you. These things need to be resized. I get it. But it would be really great if you didn't reboot these applications during the work week. It would be really great if you could come in during our change window at 3 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. Just feel free to log onto your computer at 3 a.m. on Saturday, make all these changes. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, well, I don't want to do that. And I don't blame you. I wouldn't want to do that either. So what you can do is you can schedule this action to take place at a later date, at a later time. And it's very straightforward, right? We just come up with a name. Let's do resize change window, right? We can provide a description, provide the time, right? We'll say this is Hawaii because who doesn't love Hawaii? One of the really cool things that we can do here too is we can receive updates via email. So if this is connected to our email servers or services, we are able to receive updates via email. Now, once again, you have to acknowledge that some of these workloads may be interrupted. And then once you do that, you press create. And on Saturday night at 3 in the morning, it will. Oh, did I set this right? I gotta set it to Saturday. Saturday at 3 in the morning, it will resize all of these different workloads. So I'm going to cancel out of that. Now, hopefully this has made sense so far. what I want to do from here is start to jump into something that I consider to be a little bit more complicated. Uh, Not much, but something that I think we're ready to dive deeper into. And that is alerting as well as troubleshooting. So I'm going to jump into alerts, right? And now there's quite a few different alerts that are going to be popping up here. Let's try to categorize them a little bit more. Let's maybe look at just the most recent alerts. It's one way that we can categorize it, what's popped up recently. Or maybe we want to categorize them by criticality, so we can start to triage these alerts and start to deal with only the most important alerts, right? So there's quite a few different alerts that this tool out of the box will look for. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on one of these at random here. All right. And once I've selected an alert, you'll notice that I am being directed to this alert page. We'll see what the virtual machine is being affected, or I should say what object is being affected, because this isn't limited to just looking at the virtual machines, right? It'll provide us what the alert is. In this case, one or more virtual guest machine file systems are running out of disk space. What a mouthful. Okay. Now, if we keep reading, we'll notice that there's also recommendations. And I really like the recommendations portion of this tool. And the reason that I like the recommendations portion of this tool is because, as the name implies, it'll provide a recommended action that you can take to address the different problems that might show up. It also might have a button that you can click to actually take an action, and Aria Operations will take an action on your behalf. Other times, you'll have a link to a knowledge base article that addresses the known issue that you are encountering. And really, at the end of the day, I have found that, let's be honest, 80% of the issues that you're going to run into are things that you've seen before, things that you've encountered before, things that you know how to address. But for those 20% of issues, those things take up 80% of the troubleshooting time because you've never seen them before. And having that recommendation, especially when there's an action, or especially when there's a KB article attached to it, it provides you with a place to, at the very least, start that troubleshooting process and give you a sense of direction for where you should be going, right? A couple other things that I want to call out here. We'll also notice that there is the symptoms that have caused this alert to be triggered, right? Nothing too crazy, things that you would suspect. What I want to maybe start to look at is related alerts. And I really like related alerts for a couple of different reasons. For one, I can see if this alert has been occurring on this object frequently in the past 30 days. And if this alert has been occurring on this object frequently in the past 30 days, maybe it's not just a situation, a one-off situation. Maybe there's an issue where we need to address the way in which our virtual machines are provisioned. All right. Other things that we'll also see is if there's any active occurrences of this alert on other peer objects. So are other objects also facing the same issues? All right. And this gives us a sense of, all right, is maybe our policy for, in this case, is our system for sizing our guest file systems, is our policy need to be updated? Because if I'm seeing this across 27 different objects, then that indicates to me that the initial sizing is wrong, right? Or at the very least, someone hasn't been doing their job recently. Last but not least, this will also show if there's any active alerts within the related scope. Now, I really like this because it helps answer one of the most challenging questions to answer when it comes to troubleshooting, which is essentially, okay, is this an isolated issue or is there a broader systemic problem going on? So if I look at the virtual machine, I notice that, of course, there's going to be alerts here, but I'm not seeing any issues for the data store. I'm not seeing any issues for the distributed port group. But as I start to scroll down here, I am seeing issues with, let's see, the environment, the host systems. So it starts to give us a sense of, okay, is there a situation where there's either an upstream or downstream issue that's having a trickle down effect on the rest of my environment? And it helps us begin that troubleshooting process. Again, helping us understand, is this an isolated issue, or is this a broader systemic problem? Okay. Something else I want to jump into is potential evidence. So I'm going to launch the troubleshooting workbench. Now, the troubleshooting workbench, this is something we came out with in 8.4 release of Aria Operations. We're up to 8.10. Or I'm sorry, this version is 8.10. I believe we just dropped 8.15 recently, or 8.14. But I do think it's worth just showing the interface for the troubleshooting workbench. Now, when we're doing troubleshooting, right, there's a lot of variables that we need to take into consideration, okay? But if I'm really trying to triangulate on the root cause of a problem, there's two main variables that I want to play with. And that's essentially the where and the when. So if I want to broaden or narrow the where scope, I can do that in the top left over here, right? So let's say I want to just initially start by looking at just the virtual machine itself. But let's say I want to take a broader view. I want to start looking at the virtual machine as well as the cache disk, the capacity disk, associated vSAN disk groups, et cetera, I can do that as well. So I can play with the where variable. I'm also able to play with the when variable. So maybe I want to take a broader view. Instead of looking at the past 12 hours, I'll take a look at the past 24 hours. And let's maybe narrow this down so we don't have too much going on here. All right. I'm just trying to give you all a sense of what this looks like. So a couple different things that we'll see here. We'll see, first of all, the event. So these are the metrics that have been breached, the things that have caused this alert to be triggered in the first place. Next, we'll have property changes. So has anyone changed the configuration of this environment? And maybe it's not a question of anyone, but anything. So a lot of times there might be automatic changes happening, such as DRS, the distributed resource scheduler, kicks in and it vMotions a virtual machine around. Maybe someone turned something off or turned something on or changed the size of something. Under property changes, that's where we're going to see all those different things, as the name implies. Now, last but not least is anomalous metrics. And anomalous metrics is really cool because one of the neat things about Aria Operations is it's a tool that is intelligent enough to learn the behavior of your environment. So the longer that it's in your environment, the more it understands what is standard behavior and what is deviating from standard behavior. And if something deviates from standard behavior, it will be flagged as anomalous metrics. And we can see those anomalous metrics here. All right. So let's take a look at perhaps the virtual machine itself. So something that's very important for us to understand when it comes to Aria Operations is that out of the box, when you deploy this, it is going to create what I like to call a web page for every single object within the environment. So right now we're just looking at a single virtual machine and we're staring at the summary page. So it's going to just show us some of that key information, right? And maybe we'll see the OS that's running on it, if it's powered on, the size, if there's any alerts, the remaining capacity, right? Just some utilization specs. Okay. We'll also see on the left-hand side all of the related objects, whether it's the cache disk, the vSAN disk group, right? Maybe we want to take a look at, I don't know, the host system itself, right? And if I click on all these objects, they of course have that they have that web page, right? In this case, interesting. Seeing that this is actually sitting on Amazon. So pretty cool. I'm gonna go back and gonna take a look at this VM specifically. So we can see the summary page. We can also see if there's any alerts, right? But what I think is really important to look at is the metrics tab. And the reason that I think the metrics tab is important to look at is because a lot of times I'll get the question, which is, okay, where are all the tables, graphs, recommendation, charts, et cetera, coming from within Aria Operations? Or where is all that data? How can I see that underlying data, underlying metrics? And you can see all this under the metrics tab. So if I want to, first of all, see maybe a more advanced topology of my environment and be able to understand just the relationships between, let's say, the disk groups, the data store, the virtual machine, the host, and then the cluster that might be sitting on, I can do that in a very compelling way, right? I can have an easily visualizable environment or easily visualizable format. Okay. Now, once I've selected the object that I want to dig a little bit deeper into, we'll notice that there's a whole series of different metrics that I'm able to look at. Anytime you see yellow, it indicates that, hey, there's something not right or something anomalous going on. Okay. Now, once I've identified the metric that I'm interested in this case, maybe let's just take a look at, something that's has an issue. And we want to take a look at provision spaced and compare that with the used space. And we can see that there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, right? So it's something we might want to work on. Other useful features that you might want to be aware of, just keep in mind that you are able to change the time windows if we want, right? So maybe we want to look at not just that past 24 hours, but the past 7 days, right? I can see the historical data there, right? Something else that I think is very valuable to jump into is, once again, capacity. Now, we took a look at Rightsizing already. What I want to take a look at is something very similar called Reclaim. So if I press Reclaim and then press View, right, I'm noticing something pretty similar to what we were looking at before, where we have a series of these different data centers that we are connected to. I select one of them, and once I select one of these data centers, we'll see the potential reclamation that each of these data centers has. So firstly, it'll assign a dollar value to the potential cost savings, right? It'll tell you where those potential cost savings are coming from. We can see it's coming from 106 VMs and 370 orphan disks, right? We could also see what the potential reclaimable capacity is. 92 vCPU, 182 gigs, and over 7 terabytes worth of disk space. And I'm going to guess, actually, that this is probably coming from orphan disks, right? We'll get into that in just a second. So firstly, we'll be able to see any powered off virtual machines. All right. Now, why is it important to look at these powered off virtual machines? Now, a lot of times I have seen people who have these virtual machines that have been sitting in their environment for an extended period of time, and of course, still have some sort of reserved disk space. All right. So if you have something that's been sitting in your environment, hasn't been powered on in 2 months, might be a candidate for evaluation in terms of whether it should continue to exist in your environment or not. I mean, I've seen workloads with that have been powered off for years that show up on this tool. Now, similar to before, we're able to select the different virtual machines, right? We can exclude them from the list if we want. We can export them into a CSV, and we can delete these virtual machines right from here if we want to, or we can schedule an action for it to happen later. Very similar is idle virtual machines. So virtual machines that are powered on, but they're really not doing anything, right? They just are using the bare minimum of CPU and RAM to essentially stay on, right? We'll see once again all those different virtual machines. We'll see what the potential cost savings is, what the reclaimable CPU, memory, and disk space might be, and very importantly, how long they've been idle for. Now, a question that I often get is, okay, well, what is an idle VM? What are the parameters in which we're determining something is idle? We can see a definition of what we consider idle VMs as well as powered off, snapshots, and orphan disks. But what I really like to take a look at is the settings here, because when we take a look at the settings, we can see as well as modify those parameters for our idle virtual machine. So it has to be idle for at least 7 days. We're going to exclude anything that's been provisioned the past 30 days because, right, it's not unheard of for someone to provision a whole series of virtual machines over the course of a month, and then turn them all on somewhat simultaneously after everything's been provisioned. Now, we'll also notice the idleness criteria. So essentially, we're considering something idle if it consumes less than 100 megahertz of CPU for 100% of the time. Okay. So we can see what those parameters are. Okay, cancel. Next, we might want to take a look at snapshots. All right. So snapshots, of course, they take up disk space, but something that is very important for us to keep in mind whenever it comes to to snapshots is that not only does it take up disk space, but anytime you take a snapshot, it will create a Delta file, which your data now needs to flow through. And if you have multiple stacked snapshots, that's a lot of hops that your data has to go through. So not only is it creating strain in terms of disk space, but it can also introduce latency into your environment. So really bad habit to have really old snapshots within your environment. I can see that there's some snapshots that have been around for, oh gosh, what is that? Close to, between 3 and 4 years here. All right. Now, of course, this is just a lab environment, so it doesn't matter so much, but I certainly would not recommend having something over 1,000 days old within your own environment. Now let's move on to orphaned disks. Okay, orphan disks. Some of you might know what orphan disks are, but for those of you who don't know what orphan disks are, orphan disks are essentially VMDKs that have that aren't attached to any virtual machine anymore, right? So the VMDK has been unmounted, the virtual machine's been deleted, but that VMDK still exists. Sometimes and I should say more often than sometimes, I see that people will delete VMs but don't delete those VMDKs. So these can really stack up quick, and I've seen terabytes worth of storage lost because of this. And that's something that you're certainly going to want to take into consideration. All right. Now, something that you've seen throughout this are the different dollar values that have been assigned to things. And a question that I often get asked is, well, where are these dollar values coming from? Right? How do you know how much I'm spending on CPU and servers and storage and all that? Right? And the answer is, out of the box, Aria Operations will use industry standards to determine the pricing of these things. So it's just applying industry standards. Now, if you did want to configure your own cost drivers to give you a more accurate understanding of what your costs might be, you're able to go into configure, go into cost drivers, right? And from here, this is where we're able to modify all the different cost drivers. So for example, if I want to modify my server hardware cost drivers, I'm able to do so, where I'm able to identify, what's the cost per server. That's kind of low, if you ask me. But we can identify the cost per server. Is it owned? Is it leased? When was it purchased? What's the compute percentage or the utilization percentage? Okay. So I'm able to modify these different costs. And with that, I think that this brings us to a fairly natural stopping point. There's other aspects of this tool that I very much want to dive into, and I will dive into other aspects in upcoming videos. But for now, I want to thank you all for your time. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below or reach out to me directly if you know me. And with that, thanks again and have a good day.